Chapter 11 of Abraham Lincoln, A History, Volume 4. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Abraham Lincoln, A History, Volume 4, by John Hay and John George Nicolay. Chapter 11, Missouri. The governor of Missouri, Claiborne F. Jackson, was early engaged in the secession conspiracy, though, like other border state executives, he successfully concealed his extreme designs from the public. There was an intolerant pro-slavery sentiment throughout the state, but it also had a positive and outspoken minority of strong anti-slavery citizens in a few localities, chiefly in the great commercial city of St. Louis. This minority was made up principally of its German residents and voters, numbering fully one-half of the total population of the city, which, in 1860, was 160,000. Here, in 1856, a young, talented, courageous leader and skillful politician, Francis P. Blair, Jr., though himself a slaveholder, had dared to advocate the doctrine and policy of gradual emancipation, and on that issue secured an election to Congress. The same issue, repeated in 1858, brought him sufficiently near an election to entitle him to contest his opponent's seat. In 1860, Blair and his followers, now fully acting with the Republican Party, cast 17,028 votes for Lincoln, while the remaining votes in the state were divided as follows: Douglas, 58,801, Bell, 58,372, Breckinridge, 31,317. Blair was again elected to Congress. The combined Lincoln, Douglas, and Bell vote showed an overwhelming Union majority. But the governor elected by the Douglas plurality became a disunionist and secession conspirator. With Blair as a leader, and such an organized minority at his call, the intrigues of Governor Jackson to force Missouri into secession met from the outset many difficulties, notwithstanding the governor's official powers, influential following, and the prevalent pro-slavery opinion of the state. The legislature was sufficiently subservient. It contained a majority of radical secessionists, and only about 15 unconditional Union members. But these were vigilant and active, and made most of their minority influence. The same general expedients resorted to in other states by the conspirators were used in Missouri. Visits and speeches from Southern commissioners, messages and resolutions of Southern rights and sympathy, and strong enunciation of the doctrine of non-coercion, military bills and measures to arm and control the state, finally, a sovereign state convention. Here they overshot their mark. A strong majority of Union members was elected. The convention met at Jefferson City, the state capital, adjourned to the healthier atmosphere of St. Louis, and by an outspoken report and decided votes, condemned secession and took a recess till December following. The secession leaders, however, would not accept their popular defeat. In the interim, Sumter fell, and Lincoln issued his call for troops. Governor Jackson, as we have seen, insultingly denounced the requisition as, quote, illegal, unconstitutional, revolutionary, inhuman, and diabolical, and again convened his rebel legislature in extra session to do the treasonable work which the sovereign Missouri Convention had so recently condemned. It was an essential feature of Governor Jackson's program to obtain possession of the St. Louis arsenal, and as early as January he had well nigh perfected his plot for its surrender to the state by a treacherous officer. But suspicion was aroused, the commandant changed, and the arsenal reinforced. By the middle of February, the garrison had been increased 488 irregulars and recruits. In the meantime, local intrigue was active. The secessionists organized bodies of Minutemen to capture it, while the Union men, with equal alertness, formed a safety committee and companies of home guards to join in its defense. These latter were largely drawn from the German part of the city, to which the arsenal lay contiguous, and their guardianship over it was direct and effective. Lincoln was inaugurated, and making Montgomery Blair his Postmaster General, and Edward Bates his Attorney General, Missouri had virtually 2 representatives in the cabinet. Francis P. Blair, Jr., brother of Montgomery, therefore found no great difficulty in having the command of the arsenal given to Captain Nathaniel Lyon, not only a devoted soldier, but a man of thorough anti-slavery convictions. Lyon was eager to forestall the secession conspiracy by extensive preparation and swift repression, but the department commander, General William S. Harney, and the ordnance officer whom Lyon had displaced, both of more slow and cautious temper, and reflecting the local political conservatism, thwarted and hampered Lyon and Blair, who from the beginning acted in concert. No great difficulty grew out of this antagonism till the President's call for troops. Then it created discussion, delay, want of cooperation. Blair could not get his volunteers mustered into service, and Governor Yates of Illinois could get no arms. The President finally grew impatient. Harney was relieved and called to Washington, and Lyon directed to muster in and arm the 4 Missouri regiments of volunteers with all expedition, and to send the extra arms to Springfield, Illinois, while 3 Illinois regiments were ordered to St. Louis to assist in guarding the arsenal. These orders were issued in Washington on April 20th. By this time St. Louis, like the whole Union, was wrought up to high excitement. But public opinion was more evenly divided there than elsewhere. There were Union speeches and rebel speeches, cheers for Lincoln and cheers for Davis, Union headquarters and rebel headquarters. The antagonism quickly grew into armed organizations. The Unionists were mustered, armed, and drilled at the arsenal as United States volunteers. On the other hand, Governor Jackson, having decided on revolution, formed at St. Louis a nominal camp of instruction under the state militia laws. The camp was established at Lindell's Grove, was christened Camp Jackson in honor of the governor, and was commanded by Brigadier General D. M. Frost, a West Point graduate. 2 regiments quickly assembled, and a 3rd was in process of formation. The flag of the United States still floated over the camp, and many Unionists were in the ranks of the old holiday parade militia companies, but the whole leadership and animating motive were in aid of rebellion. It was soon literally one of Jefferson Davis's outposts. As soon as Governor Jackson had avowed his treason, he dispatched 2 confidential agents to Montgomery to solicit arms and aid. Jefferson Davis wrote in reply, quote, "After learning as well as I could from the gentlemen accredited to me what was most needful for the attack on the arsenal, I have directed that Captains Greene and Duke should be furnished with 2 12-pounder howitzers and 2 32-pounder guns, with the proper ammunition for each. These from the commanding hills will be effective both against the garrison and to breach the enclosing walls of the place. I concur with you as to the great importance of capturing the arsenal and securing its supplies, rendered doubly important by the means taken to obstruct your commerce and render you unarmed victims of a hostile invasion. We look anxiously and hopefully for the day when the Star of Missouri shall be added to the constellation of the Confederate States of America." End quote. In reality, he regarded the star as already in the constellation. 3 days later, the rebel Secretary of War wrote to the governor, quote, "Can you arm and equip 1 regiment of infantry for service in Virginia to rendezvous at Richmond? Transportation will be provided by this government. The regiment to elect its own officers, and must enlist for not less than 12 months, unless sooner discharged." End quote. In face of the overwhelming Union sentiment of Missouri, so lately manifested by the action of the State Convention, Governor Jackson was not prepared for so bold a proceeding, and therefore wrote in reply, quote, "Yours of the 26th ultimo via Louisville is received. I have no legal authority to furnish the men you desire. Missouri, you know, is yet under the tyranny of Lincoln's government, so far at least as forms go. We are woefully deficient here in arms, and cannot furnish them at present, but so far as men are concerned, we have plenty of them, ready, willing, and anxious to march at any moment to the defense of the South. Our legislature has just met, and I doubt not will give me all necessary authority over the matter. If you can arm the men, they will go wherever wanted, and to any point where they may be most needed. I send this to Memphis by private hand, being afraid to trust our mails or telegraphs. Let me hear from you by the same means. Missouri can and will put 100,000 men in the field if required. We are using every means to arm our people, and until we are better prepared must move cautiously. I write this in confidence. with my prayers for your success, etc." First to capture the arsenal, and then to reinforce the armies of Jefferson Davis, were doubtless the immediate objects of Camp Jackson. It would be a convenient nucleus, which, at the given signal, would draw to itself similar elements from different parts of the State. Already the arsenal at Liberty, the same one from which arms were stolen to overawe Kansas in 1855, had been seized on April 20th, and its contents appropriated by secessionists in western Missouri. Jeff M. Thompson had been for some weeks drilling a rebel camp at St. Joseph, and threatening the neighboring arsenal at Leavenworth. The legislature was maturing a comprehensive military bill, which would give the governor power to concentrate and use these scattered fractions of regiments. Until this was passed, Camp Jackson had a lawful existence under the old militia laws. But the Union Safety Committee, and especially Mr. Blair and Captain Lyon, followed the governor's intrigue at every step, and reporting the growing danger to Washington, received from President Lincoln extraordinary powers to overcome it. An order to Captain Lyon read as follows: "The President of the United States directs that you enroll in the military service of the United States the loyal citizens of St. Louis and vicinity, not exceeding, with those heretofore enlisted, 10,000 in number, for the purpose of maintaining the authority of the United States for the protection of the peaceable inhabitants of Missouri. And you will, if deemed necessary for that purpose by yourself, and Messrs. Oliver T. Filley, John Howe, James O. Broadhead, Samuel T. Glover, J. Witzig, and Francis P. Blair, Jr., proclaim martial law in the city of St. Louis." It was upon this order, with certain additional details, that General Scott made the endorsement, "It is revolutionary times, and therefore I do not object to the irregularity of this." The Union Safety Committee soon had indisputable evidence of the insurrectionary purposes and preparations. On the night of May 8th, cannon, ammunition, and several hundred muskets sent by Jefferson Davis were landed at the St. Louis levee from a New Orleans steamer, and at once transferred to Camp Jackson. They had been brought from the arsenal at Baton Rouge, Louisiana, and were a part of the United States arms captured there in January by the governor of that state. The proceeding did not escape the vigilance of the Safety Committee, but the material of war was allowed to go unobstructed to the camp. The next day Captain Lyon visited Camp Jackson in disguise, and, thus acquainting himself personally with its condition, strategical situation, and surroundings, matured his plan for its immediate capture. All legal obstacles which had been urged against such a summary proceeding were now removed by the actual presence in the camp of the hostile supplies brought from Baton Rouge. At 2 o'clock in the afternoon of May 10th, a strong battalion of regulars with 6 pieces of artillery, 4 regiments of Missouri volunteers, and 2 regiments of home guards, all under the command of Captain Lyon, were rapidly marching through different streets to Camp Jackson. Arrived there, it was but a moment's work to gain the appointed positions surrounding the camp and to plant the batteries ready for action on commanding elevations. General Frost heard of their coming, and undertook to avert the blow by sending Lyon a letter denying that he or his command, or any other part of the State forces, meant any hostility to the United States, though it was himself who had endeavored to corrupt the commandant of the arsenal in January, and who, in a letter to the governor, had outlined and recommended these very military proceedings in Missouri, convening the legislature, obtaining heavy guns from Baton Rouge, seizing the Liberty arsenal, and establishing this camp of instruction expressly to oppose President Lincoln. So far from being moved from his purpose, Lyon refused to receive Frost's letter, and, as soon as his regiments were posted, sent a written demand for the immediate surrender of Camp Jackson, "with no other conditions than that all persons surrendering under this demand shall be humanely and kindly treated." The case presented no alternative, and seeing that he was dealing with a resolute man, Frost surrendered with the usual protest. Camp and property were taken in possession, arms were stacked, and preparation made to march the prisoners to the arsenal, where, on the following day, they were paroled and disbanded. Up to this time everything had proceeded without casualty, or even turbulent disorder, but an immense assemblage of the street populace followed the march and crowded about the camp. Most of them were peaceful spectators whose idle curiosity rendered them forgetful of danger, but among the number was the usual proportion of lawless city rowdies, of combative instincts whose very nature impelled them to become the foremost elements of disorder and revolution. Many of them had rushed to the scene of expected conflict with such weapons as they could seize, and now, as the homeward march began, they pressed defiantly upon the troops, with cheers for Jefferson Davis, and insults and bitter imprecations upon the soldiers. It seems a fatality that when a city mob in anger, and soldiers with loaded guns, are by any circumstances thrown into close contact, it produces the same incidents and results. There are insult and retort, a rush and a repulse, then comes a shower of missiles, finally a pistol shot, and after it, a return volley from the troops, followed by an irregular fusillade from both sides. Who began it, or how it was done, can never be ascertained. It so happened on this occasion, both at the head and rear of the marching column, and during a momentary halt. And, as usual, the guilty escaped, and innocent men, women, and children fell in their blood, while the crowd fell pell-mell in mortal terror. 2 or 3 soldiers and some 15 citizens were killed, and many wounded. As in Baltimore, the event threw St. Louis into the excitement of a general riot. Gun stores were broken into, and newspaper offices threatened, but the police checked the outbreak, though public tranquillity and safety were not entirely restored for several days. Aside from its otherwise deplorable results, the riot produced, or rather magnified, a military and political complication. On the day after the capture of Camp Jackson, General Harney returned from Washington, and once more assumed command. His journey had been eventful. Arrested by the rebels at Harper's Ferry, he had been sent to Richmond. There the authorities, anxious to win him over to secession by kindness, set him at liberty. Proof against their blandishments, however, he merely thanked them for their courtesy, and, loyal soldier as he was, proceeded to his superiors and his duty at Washington. This circumstance greatly aided his explanations and excuses before General Scott, President Lincoln, and the Cabinet, and secured his restoration as department commander. But his return to St. Louis proved ill-timed. His arrival there, in the midst of the excitement over the capture of Camp Jackson and the riot, emphasized and augmented the antagonism between the radical Unionists, led by Blair and Lyon, and the pro-slavery and conservative Unionists, who now made the general their rallying point. Paying too much attention to the complaints and relying too blindly upon the false representations and promises of secession conspirators like Frost, and greatly underrating the active elements of rebellion in Missouri, Harney looked coldly upon the volunteers and talked of disbanding the Home Guards. This brought him into conflict with the Union Safety Committee and President Lincoln's orders. Delegations of equally influential citizens, representing both sides, went to Washington, in a stubborn mistrust of each other's motives. In their appeal to Lincoln, Lyon's friends found a ready advocate in Mr. Blair, Postmaster General, and Harney's friends in Mr. Bates, the Attorney General, and the Missouri discord was thus in a certain degree, and at a very early date, transplanted into the Cabinet itself. The local embitterment in St. Louis, beginning then, ran on for several years, and in its varying and shifting phases gave the President no end of trouble in his endeavor from first to last to be just to each faction. Harney was strongly entrenched in the personal friendship of General Scott. Besides, he was greatly superior in army rank, being a brigadier general, while Lyon was only a captain. On the other hand, Lyon's capture of Camp Jackson had shown his energy, courage, and usefulness, and had given him great popular applause. Immediately to supersede him seemed like a public censure. It was one of the many cases where unforeseen circumstances created a dilemma involving irritated personal susceptibilities and delicate questions of public expediency. President Lincoln took action promptly and firmly, though tempered with that forbearance by which he was so constantly enabled to extract the greatest advantage out of the most perplexing complications. The delegations from Missouri, with their letters, arrived on May 16th, a week after the Camp Jackson affair. Having heard both sides, Lincoln decided that in any event Lyon must be sustained. He therefore ordered that Harney should be relieved and that Lyon be made a brigadier general of volunteers. In order, however, that this change might not fall too harshly, Lincoln did not make his decision public, but wrote confidentially to Frank Blair under date of May 18th, My dear Sir, we have a great deal of anxiety here about St. Louis. I understand an order is gone from the War Department to you to be delivered or withheld in your discretion, relieving General Harney from his command. I was not quite satisfied with the order when it was made, though on the whole I thought it best to make it, but since then I have become more doubtful of its propriety. I do not write now to countermand it, but to say I wish you would withhold it unless in your judgment the necessity to the contrary is very urgent. There are several reasons for this. We had better have him a friend than an enemy. It will dissatisfy a good many who otherwise would be quiet. More than all, we first relieve him, then restore him, and now if we relieve him again, the public will ask, why all this vacillation? Still, if in your judgment it is indispensable, let it be so. Upon receipt of this letter, both Blair and Lyon, with commendable prudence, determined to carry out the President's suggestion. Since Harney's return from Washington, his words and acts had been more in conformity with their own policy. He had published a proclamation defending and justifying the capture of Camp Jackson, and declaring that Missouri must share the destiny of the Union, and that the whole power of the United States would be exerted to maintain her in it. Especially was the proclamation unsparing in its denunciation of the recent military bill of the rebel legislature. This bill cannot be regarded in any other light than an indirect secession ordinance, ignoring even the forms resorted to by other states. Manifestly, its most material provisions are in conflict with the Constitution and laws of the United States. To this extent, it is a nullity, and cannot and ought not to be upheld. Within the field and scope of my command and authority, the supreme law of the land must and shall be maintained, and no subterfuges, whether in the forms of legislative acts or otherwise, can be permitted to harass or oppress the good and law-abiding people of Missouri. I shall exert my authority to protect their persons and property from violations of every kind, and I shall deem it my duty to suppress all unlawful combinations of men, whether formed under pretext of military organizations or otherwise." He also suggested to the War Department the enlistment of Home Guards, and the need of additional troops in Missouri. So far as mere theory and intention could go, all this was without fault. There can be no question of Harney's entire loyalty, and of his skill and courage as a soldier dealing with open enemies. Unfortunately, he did not possess the adroitness and daring necessary to circumvent the secret machinations of traitors. Governor Jackson, on the contrary, seems to have belonged to the race of conspirators. He and his rebel legislature, convened in special session at Jefferson City, were panic-stricken by the news of the capture of Camp Jackson. On that night of May 10th, the governor, still claiming and wielding the executive power of the state, sent a train to destroy the telegraph and to burn the railroad bridge over the Osage River, in order to keep the bayonets of Lyon and Blair at a safe distance. At night the legislature met for business, the secession members, belted with pistols and bowie knives, with guns lying across their desks or leaning against chairs and walls, while sentinels and soldiers filled the corridors and approaches. The city was in an uproar of alarms and apprehension. The young ladies of the female seminary and many families were moved across the river for security. Until late in the night the secession governor and his secession majority hurried their treasonable legislation through the mere machinery of parliamentary forms. It was under these conditions that the famous military bill and kindred acts were passed. It appropriated $3 millions, authorized the issue of bonds, diverted the school fund, anticipated 2 years' taxes, made the governor a military dictator, and ignored the federal government. It was, in truth, as Harney called it, an indirect secession ordinance. Armed with these revolutionary enactments, but still parading his state authority, Governor Jackson cautiously attempted to consolidate his military power. Ex-Governor Sterling Price was appointed Major General commanding the Missouri State Guard, who, more conveniently to cloak the whole conspiracy, sought an interview with General Harney, and entered with him into a public agreement, vague and general in its terms, of restoring peace and good order to the people of the State in subordination to the laws of the general and State governments. General Price, having by commission full authority over the militia of the State of Missouri, undertakes, with the sanction of the governor of the State, already declared, to direct the whole power of the State officers to maintain order within the State among the people thereof, and General Harney publicly declares that, this object being thus assured, he can have no occasion, as he has no wish, to make military movements which might otherwise create excitements and jealousies, which he most earnestly desires to avoid. Blinded and lulled by treasonous professions, Harney failed to see that this was evading the issue, and committing the flock to the care of the wolf. Price's undertaking to maintain order was in fact nothing else than the organization of rebel companies at favorable points in the State, and immediately brought a shower of Union warnings and complaints to Harney. Within a week, the information received caused him to inform Price of these complaints, and of his intention to organize Union home guards for protection. More serious still, trustworthy news came that an invasion was threatened from the Arkansas border. Price replied, with his blandest assurances, denying everything. The aggressions, he said, were acts of irresponsible individuals. To organize home guards would produce neighborhood collision and civil war. He should carry out the agreement to the letter. Should troops enter Missouri from Arkansas or any other State, he would cause them to return instanter. Harney, taking such declarations at their surface value, and yielding himself to the suggestions and advice of the St. Louis conservatives, who disliked Lyon and hated Blair, remained inactive, notwithstanding a sharp admonition from Washington. The Adjutant General wrote, "The President observes with concern that, notwithstanding the pledge of the State authorities to cooperate in preserving peace in Missouri, loyal citizens in great numbers continue to be driven from their homes. The professions of loyalty to the Union by the State authorities of Missouri are not to be relied on. They have already falsified their professions too often, and are too far committed to secession to be entitled to your confidence, and you can only be sure of their desisting from their wicked purposes when it is out of their power to prosecute them. You will, therefore, be unceasingly watchful of their movements, and not permit the clamors of their partisans and opponents of the wise measures already taken to prevent you from checking every movement against the Government, however disguised, under the pretended State authority. The authority of the United States is paramount, and whenever it is apparent that a movement, whether by color of State authority or not, is hostile, you will not hesitate to put it down." Harney had announced this identical policy in his proclamation of May 14th. The difficulty was that he failed to apply and enforce his own doctrines, or rather, that he lacked penetration to discern the treachery of the State authorities. He replied to the War Department, "My confidence in the honor and integrity of General Price, in the purity of his motives, and in his loyalty to the Government remains unimpaired. His course as President of the State Convention, that voted by a large majority against submitting an ordinance of secession, and his efforts since that time to calm the elements of discord, have served to confirm the high opinion of him I have for many years entertained." Lyon and Blair were much better informed, and the latter wrote to Lincoln, "I have to-day delivered to General Harney the order of the 16th of May above mentioned, relieving him, feeling that the progress of events and condition of affairs in this State make it incumbent upon me to assume the grave responsibility of this act, the discretionary power in the premises having been given me by the President." The President and the Secretary of War duly sustained the act. This change of command soon brought matters in Missouri to a crisis. The State authorities were quickly convinced that Lyon would tolerate no evasion or misunderstanding. They therefore asked an interview, and Lyon sent Governor Jackson and General Price a safeguard to visit St. Louis. They on the one part, and Lyon and Blair on the other, with one or two witnesses, held an interview of 4 hours on June 11th. The governor proposed that the State should remain neutral, that he would not attempt to organize the militia under the military bill on condition that the Union home guards should be disarmed, and no further Federal troops be stationed in Missouri. Lyon rejected this proposal, insisting that the governor's rebel State Guards should be disarmed and the military bill abandoned. and that the federal government should enjoy its unrestricted right to move and station its troops throughout the state to repel invasion or protect its citizens. This the governor refused. So the discussion terminated. Jackson and Price hurried by a special train back to Jefferson City, burning bridges as they went. Arrived at the capital, the governor at once published a proclamation of war. He recited the interview and its result, called 50,000 militia into the active service of the state, and closed his proclamation by coupling together the preposterous and irreconcilable announcements of loyalty to the United States and declaration of war against them, a very marvel of impudence, even among the numerous kindred curiosities of secession literature. Footnote. In issuing this proclamation, I hold it to be my solemn duty to remind you that Missouri is still one of the United States, that the executive department of the state government does not arrogate to itself the power to disturb that relation, that that power has been wisely vested in a convention which will, at the proper time, express your sovereign will, and that meanwhile it is your duty to obey all constitutional requirements of the federal government. But it is equally my duty to advise you that your first allegiance is due to your own state, and that you are under no obligation whatever to obey the unconstitutional edicts of the military despotism which has enthroned itself at Washington, nor to submit to the infamous and degrading sway of its wicked minions in this state. No brave and true-hearted Missourian will obey one or submit to the other. Rise, then, and drive out ignominiously the invaders who have dared to desecrate the soil which your labors have made fruitful, and which is consecrated by your homes. Jackson, Proclamation, June 12, 1861. Peckham, General Nathaniel Lyon, page 252. This sudden announcement of active hostility did not take Lyon by surprise. Thoroughly informed of the conspirators' plans, he had made preparations for equally energetic action. Though Jackson had crippled the railroad, the Missouri River was an open military highway, and numerous swift steamboats lay at the St. Louis wharf. On the afternoon of June 13th, he embarked one of his regular batteries and several battalions of his Missouri volunteers, and steamed with all possible speed up the river to Jefferson City, the capital of the state, leading the movement in person. He arrived on the 15th of June, and landing, took possession of the town without resistance, and raised the Union flag over the State House. The governor and his adherents hurriedly fled, his Secretary of State carrying off the Great Seal with which to certify future pretended official acts. There had been no time for the rebellion to gather any head at the capital, but at the town of Boonville, 50 miles farther up the river, General Price was collecting some fragments of military companies. This nucleus of opposition Lyon determined also to destroy. Leaving but a slight guard at the capital, he re-embarked his force next day, and reaching Boonville on the 17th, landed without difficulty, and put the half-formed rebel militia to flight after a spirited skirmish. General Price prudently kept away from the encounter, and Governor Jackson, who had come hither, and who witnessed the defeat from a hill 2 miles distant, once more betook himself to flight. 2 on the Union and 15 on the rebel side were killed. This affair was the outbreak of open warfare in Missouri, though secret military aggression against the United States government had been for nearly 6 months carried on by the treasonable state officials, aided as far as possible by the conspiracy in the South. The local state government of Missouri, thus broken by the hostility of Governor Jackson and subordinate officials, was soon regularly restored. The Missouri State Convention, chosen, as already related, with the design of carrying the state into rebellion, but which, unexpectedly to the conspirators, remained true to the Union, had, on adjourning its session from March to December, wisely created an emergency committee with power to call it together on any necessary occasion. This committee now issued its call, under which the convention assembled in Jefferson City on the 22nd of July. Many of its members had joined the rebellion, but a full constitutional quorum remained, and took up the task of reconstructing the disorganized machinery of civil administration. By a series of ordinances, it declared the state offices vacant, abrogated the military bill and other treasonable legislation, provided for new elections, and finally, on the 31st of July, inaugurated a provisional government, which thereafter made the city of St. Louis its official headquarters. Hamilton R. Gamble, a conservative, was made governor. He announced his unconditional adherence to the Union, and his authority was immediately recognized by the greater portion of the state. Missouri thus remained throughout the entire war, both in form and in substance, a state of the Union. Nevertheless, a considerable minority of its population, scattered in many parts, was strongly tinctured with sympathy for the rebellion. The conspiracy so long nursed by Governor Jackson and his adherents had taken deep and pernicious root. An anomalous condition of affairs suddenly sprung up. Amidst a strongly dominant loyalty, there smoldered the embers of rebellion, and during the whole Civil War there blazed up fitfully, often where least expected, the flames of neighborhood strife and guerrilla warfare, to an extent and with a fierceness not equaled in any other state. We shall have occasion to narrate how, under cover of this sentiment, the leaders of secession bands and armies made repeated and desolating incursions. Some months later, ex-Governor Jackson, with his perambulating state seal, set up a pretended legislature and state government, and the Confederate authorities at Richmond enacted the farce of admitting Missouri to the Southern Confederacy. It was, however, from first to last, a palpable sham. The Confederate officials in Missouri had no capital or archives, controlled no population, permanently held no territory, collected no taxes, and Jackson was nothing more than a fugitive pretender, finding temporary refuge within Confederate camps. End of chapter 11. Recording by Owen Cook in Potawatomi ceded land.